Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Gert, for the introduction, and thank you all for attending this session. The manuscript transmission of Augustine's De Civitate Dei has been the main object of my research over the last 2 years and a half, and I'm delighted to be able to present part of the results to such a distinguished consensus of specialists. In the first half of my presentation, I will describe the main features of this manuscript transmission, the main challenges it poses, and the strategies adopted by our research group in order to tackle them. As my paper is the first in a series devoted to the philological aspects of the Civitate Dei, this overview can also be regarded as a sort of introduction to the whole session. The second part will focus on a specific case study, namely the Carolingian edition produced at Saint-Amand in the first quarter of the 9th century, which is nowadays reflected by 2 extant copies, held respectively in Cologne and Cambrai. The manuscript transmission of Augustine's De Civitate Dei has been the object of a very limited number of studies since the publication of the Editio Teubneriana by Alphonse Kalb in 1928-29. This edition updates Bernard Dombard's 3rd edition, published partly posthumously in 1905-08. The same text, with minor changes, was printed in the Corpus Christianorum series in 1955. In 1982, Michael Gorman published a list of manuscripts dating from before the 12th century, as a first step towards a revision of Dombard's text on the basis of a broader and more accurately selected sample of witnesses. In 1984, Alain Stoclet wrote an extensive article on the dissemination of the Civitate Dei up to Carolingian times, based, however, only on the material features of the extant copies and on the hints provided by medieval library catalogues. More recently, Emanuela Colombi has published an article on the editorial arrangements of pre-10th century manuscripts and on the distribution of their paratexts, pursuing a line of enquiry inaugurated by Guglielmo Cavallo. In 2019, the transmission of 4 sets of tabulae capitulorum and of 5 sets of copied marginal annotations were examined by Colombi and Jessica Schiao, respectively. In the framework of the research project currently being carried out at KU Leuven, a sample of the Civitate Dei's main text has been collated for the first time against all known pre-10th century copies. On the basis of these collations, Julia Aguilar and I are working on a partial and tentative stemmatical analysis. This manuscript transmission presents 4 traits that correspond to as many challenges for the philologist. The most relevant and best known is its breadth. André Villemart's list, with the updates of the Corpus Christianorum edition, records 394 manuscript copies of this work. I have counted 205 further copies listed in the 11 volumes of the Vienna corpus which have appeared so far, and another 20 copies, mostly fragments, added by Gorman. In the framework of the Leuvenian project, a list of 96 new manuscripts has been published by Fabio della Schiava, Alexandra Verek, and myself, updating the census to 715 items, including fragments and excerpts. If we wish to limit our survey to those manuscripts transmitting 1 or more books of the City of God, then the final count drops to 430 units, which is still a remarkable number. Such a broad transmission has always prevented scholars from taking all extant copies into consideration. In line with our predecessors, we have decided to focus on early medieval transmission, which is the closest in time to the author and thus, a priori, the most important for the reconstruction of the original. For our research, we took into account 65 pre-10th century manuscripts of the Civitate Dei, plus one dated to the 10th. 41 of them are partial and complete copies. The remaining 25 survive today as 31 fragments. From a chronological point of view, these copies are unevenly distributed over 5 centuries, from the 5th to the 9th. In the first 4 centuries, very few copies were produced, and essentially in 3 areas: Southern Italy in late antiquity, Northern Italy in the 6th century, and Northern France in the 8th century. Manuscripts dated to the turn of the 8th and the 9th century originated in the Cambrai area and in Bavaria. In the 9th century, the City of God was intensively copied in several cultural centers of the Carolingian Empire, located in the regions of Neustria, Austrasia, central and southern France, Alemannia, Bavaria, and northern Italy. Besides the number of witnesses, another well-known challenging feature is the extraordinary length of this text, that consists of 22 books. In light of this, we decided to limit ourselves to a collation sample of 5 non-consecutive books, namely 1, 6, 13, 18, and 22, one for each tome of the 5-volume arrangement recommended by Augustine himself in the famous letter 1a to Firmus. This collation is still ongoing as regards books 18 and 22, whereas book 1 and 6, examined by myself, and book 13, examined by Julia, have been completely collated. Another notorious problem frequently affecting texts with a broad transmission is contamination. Our collations confirmed Cavallo's and Colombi's claim. The transmission of the Civitate Dei is heavily contaminated, and has been from the very beginning. Indeed, genealogical relations between copies can only be partially retraced, and mostly at the lower levels of the stemma. We will delve into a concrete example of this in the second half of this paper. For now, I will limit myself to noting that there are several historical reasons behind the pervasiveness of contamination in this tradition. First, the relevance of the work itself. If medieval scholars had a strong interest in accessing a reliable text of the Civitate Dei, it is likely that they often resorted to other exemplars to amend their copies. Second, its broad dissemination. Due to the abundance of copies available, medieval scribes could easily find another model against which to check their own in case of doubt. Third, contamination was fostered by the peculiar way in which the work was transmitted in late antiquity and early Middle Ages. The famous piecemeal publication arranged by Augustine, as well as the extraordinary length of the work, forced late antique and medieval copyists to compile their complete editions by juxtaposing partial witnesses pertaining to different branches of the tradition. This implies that stemmatical relations are unstable, in the sense that manuscripts migrate from one family to the other depending on the book in question. And, therefore, as we will see, it is most likely impossible to draw a synthetic stemma of the whole work. Lastly, despite Augustine's exhortation to Firmus to have the text copied in 2 or 5 volumes according to the partition of the contents, the early circulation of unauthorized, non-standard editions in 2, 3, or 4 volumes also fostered contamination. In fact, the scribes must have often had at their disposal partially overlapping models pertaining to different editions, and, whenever this was the case, they must have frequently succumbed to the temptation of checking the text of both their exemplars when copying the overlapping section. The last challenge that future editors of the Civitate Dei will have to tackle is the possibility of authorial variants. In letter 1a to Firmus, Augustine alludes to a revision of the entire work carried out before sending the copy to his Carthaginian friend. Etiam mihi relectus, he writes. Likewise, through Augustine's letter 2 to Firmus, we learn about further historical circumstances that may have resulted in the proliferation of precocious secondary readings, among which I only quote Firmus' review of the first 10 books. Even before these two epistles came to light, in a note to the second volume of the critical edition, Kalb considered the possibility that the variant readings opposing the two codices antiquiores L and C may have originated in Augustine's own day. According to Kalb, L may have stemmed from the first piecemeal edition of the Civitate Dei, whereas C may reflect the complete and revised version of the work. In this respect, my collation of books 1 and 6 has highlighted a series of adiaphora variants between these two copies, and between them and the other main family of manuscripts. Research on this topic is still ongoing, but no firm evidence that these variants should be attributed to Augustine in person has emerged so far, though they certainly originated no later than a century and a half after his death. Let's now take a look at the provisional stemmata of books 1 and 6. As you can see, first, they are not identical, since, as I said, genealogical relations between manuscripts vary according to the book in question. Also, many witnesses testify either to book 1 or 6. Second, extensive contamination results in several horizontal contacts. Third, the stemmata are not closed at the top, since research on the relation between L, C and C is still ongoing, and I do not wish to take a position on the matter for now. What is certain is that the two late antique witnesses, L and C, and their descripti, do not fit into any of the families I have been able to isolate. The majority of the Carolingian copies stem from Psi, which in turn comprises 3 subgroups. Eta, spread in 9th century northern France. Theta, a pre-Carolingian family that includes manuscripts produced in France, central Italy and Alemannia. And Gamma, that encompasses Bavarian, northern Italian and Spanish copies. Sometimes perturbations have prevented us from precisely positioning the contaminated copies within the stemma, as is the case, for instance, with A, B and Beta in Book 1, listed in the bottom left corner of the stemma. However, whenever we preserve the very copy where contamination took place, we can at least try to establish its genealogical relations by examining its readings ante and post correctionem. Manuscripts of this type also offer a privileged vantage point to study medieval book production and textual criticism techniques. Among these medieval editions, so to speak, is VA. This manuscript was written at St. Gallen at the time of Abbot Grimaldus, using as the main exemplar a Theta copy, carefully checked against a Gamma exemplar. Another edition, O1, was created at Würzburg under the supervision of Bishop Gottsbaldus in the mid-9th century, this time by correcting a gamma model against a theta one in a somewhat sloppier way compared to St. Gallen's high standard of textual criticism. Lastly, we have K, which is represented as isolated from the rest of the stemma simply because it would have been physically too complicated for me to link it with all the manuscripts used for its completion. In what follows, I will discuss precisely K's complex thematic position, also in relation with its descriptus Ca. The siglum K stands for Köln, Dombibliothek, 75. According to Bernard Bischoff, this manuscript was produced at Saint-Amand at the time of Arno, first Archbishop of Salzburg and Abbot of Saint-Amand, good friend of Alcuin and trusted functionary of Charlemagne. CA stands for Cambrai, Bibliothèque Municipale, 350, produced in Cambrai in the second third of the 9th century. As you may have noticed looking at the previous slide, K underwent at least 2 subsequent correction campaigns, each of which based on a different exemplar. In the lower part of the slide, you can see a schematic representation of each of its textual layers: K, the main text, K2, its first corrector, and K3, the second corrector. In the upper part of the slide, I have reproduced a simplified version of family Psi, with its 3 main branches, eta, theta, and gamma. K's main text depends from an already contaminated ancestor X, as it shares conjunctive secondary readings with both family eta and family theta. Due to time constraints, I cannot discuss here the readings on which I rely for my schematic claims, so you have to trust me on this for the moment. Anyway, all secondary readings will be extensively dealt with in the written version of my paper. Conversely, the title of K, its incipit explicit formulations, and its copied set of marginal annotations, this so-called Gassia series, are all typical of another family, namely gamma, and were therefore copied from yet another exemplar, which belonged to this branch. Hence, K's copies, or the scribes responsible for its ancestor, which is less probable as we will see in what follows, decided to complement the text of their main exemplar X with the paratext of a gamma witness. As we have seen, K underwent 2 main correction campaigns, performed by 2 distinct hands, or rather groups of hands. The earliest, K2, corrects the text on the basis of a copy of the same family from which K's paratext and annotations come from, namely gamma. K2 is indeed a scribe, or better, a group of scribes, working at Saint-Amand in close contact with the 5 copyists responsible for the main text of K. Actually, they may even be identified, at least partly, with those scribes. Besides the fact that K2 depends on the same branch as the paratext of K, the claim that he was a Saint-Amand scribe is supported by 2 further observations. First, the variant readings recorded by K2 in the margins, as well as its corrections, are all paleographically very close to the script of the main text. See, for instance, the uncial D employed both by the main hand and by the corrector at the beginning of some words. The other piece of evidence is provided by K2's Gironian notes, recently published by Martin Hellman, on whose edition I base myself for the spelling out of these tachygraphical signs. Unlike the marginalia in Latin letters, the Tironian notes seem to convey remarks specifically addressed by K2 to his colleagues, rather than to the final readers. As a matter of fact, he employs shorthand for specific purposes, such as expressing various degrees of certainty regarding alternative variants and prompting further corrections. To give just a few examples, here K2 corrects the corrupted pepere of K to pepercere in Latin letters and adds the comment putamus in Tironian notes. Again, here K2 prompted the correction from exilius to exilius by writing in Tironian notes per duo L debet fieri. Getting back to my main point, why can these Tironian annotations be used as evidence to locate K2 at Saint-Amand? Well, because a half shorthand note on folio 145 verso reads hic incipit lo, according to Hellman, standing for Lotarius. This annotation is placed in correspondence with a glaring change of hand in the main text. From hand D, who copied it until in tres partes, to hand E, who copied it from distribuit to the end of the manuscript. Therefore, this marginale proves that K2 was acquainted with a group of scribes who copied the main text, as he takes notes of the name of the one who was in charge of copying its last section. Similarly, on folio 150 recto, a Tironian note states usque hic factum est requirere a Rohingo, providing the name of the personal responsible for the revision, a task with which he was entrusted by his supervisor, who presumably wrote this note. What is more, the Tironian annotation hic is repeatedly used to mark those spots where the glosses from the Gassia series had to be entered, so that they are copied next to the commented text. So, to sum up, the analysis of Tironian notes demonstrates that behind the sigla K and K2 there lies the same team of scribes working together on the same project at Saint-Amand, along with their supervisor. They are responsible for the main text, taken from the contaminated model, the incipit explicit formulations, the first layer of corrections, and the addition of the Gassia series, all drawn from their second model, Gamma. Consequently, we can imagine that the director of Saint-Amand's scriptorium examined the two copies at his disposal, X and Gamma, discovering a more elaborate system of paratext in the latter. For some reasons, he decided in the first place to keep the contaminated copy X as the reference antigraph, and to transcribe from Gamma only its paratextual apparatuses. Subsequently, he made Rohingus and his anonymous fellows collate the copy obtained against the Gamma model also on the level of the main text. Let's now quickly analyze the work of the other main revisor of K, K3. K3 is a later Caroline hand characterized by a more rigid ductus and by a V-shaped U. He corrects K's text, often erasing K2's alternative readings, and introduces marginal variants by formulations such as in aliis, vel, and alibi. Stemmatical analysis has shown that the manuscript from which he took his variants is close to theta, and to AU in particular, a copy produced in the last decades of the 9th century in the region of Autun. So, in short, K underwent two systematic correction campaigns over the years, the first immediately after it was produced, and the second possibly in Cologne, at the latest in the 11th century. Contrary to what Hellman assumes based on previous bibliography, K2's Tironian notes were not added in Cologne, where K probably arrived at the earliest in the second half of the 9th century. Now that we have assessed the stemmatical position of K, we can move on to its relation with CA. This manuscript, which I should recall was produced in mid-9th century Cambrai, roughly 40 kilometers away from Saint-Amand, constantly follows either K or K2 when they display errors typical of theta, eta, and gamma. CA also transmits first-hand Gaussia series annotations and displays a system of incipit-explicit formulations comparable to the one of K. It has not been possible to retrieve any separative error of K and K2 against CA, whereas CA displays several errors against the rest of the tradition. These considerations suggest that CA is a descriptus of K rather than stemming from the same source as the latter. This hypothesis is confirmed by the following two arguments. The first is the omission of CA on folio 5 verso, which is not due to a saut du même homme and precisely corresponds to a line of K, namely line 18 on folio 8 verso. The gap has been filled either by the same scribe of CA or by another reviewer. The quality of the reproduction often does not allow us to establish a distinction between the two. The second piece of evidence is more complicated and requires some explanation. In this passage, paragraph 12 of the first book, Augustine is explaining that funerary rituals, which had not always been performed for those who had died during the sack of Rome, are of greater help to the living than to the dead. He supports this claim by affirming that pagan philosophers too showed contempt for and little interest in the destiny of the body after death, to the extent that a poet, namely Lucan in the Pharsalia, stated, "Celo tegitur qui non habet urnam." K reads habet urnam instead of habet urnam. In the margin, K2 comments, "Ita erat divisum," in Tironian notes, "qui non habet urnam," in Latin letters. The scribe of CA misinterpreted his antigraph's shorthand and transformed "ita erat divisum" into "ita erit derisum suum qui non habet urnam." Hence, CA transforms this note into a content-related remark, suggesting Lucan quotation be interpreted as a way of mocking those who have not been properly buried, which is the opposite of Augustine's point. This note most probably originates from K itself, as it comments upon its own secondary reading, and is consistent with the way of working of K2, in terms of both content and form. It is indeed a remark on the correctness of the text, written in a mix of Latin characters and Tironian annotations. In light of this, it is reasonably safe to infer that CA was copied from K, or from a copy incredibly close to it. To conclude, the study of the layers of corrections in K and of its relation to CA shows that the paratexts alone, while providing a crucial access point to this broad and contaminated tradition, may be insufficient to deeply understand the complicated network of relations between manuscripts of the Civitate Dei. In a study published in 2020, where I attempted the first classification of the witnesses, mostly based on their paratexts, I put K and CA together with gamma. As we have seen, the situation has proven to be far more complex than initially suggested by an examination of the annotations alone. Secondly, the case of K and CA is emblematic of the pervasiveness and depth of the contamination processes that a single exemplar could undergo, or, to put it differently, of the refined book production methodologies adopted by Carolingian scribes. Those copies of the Civitate Dei that cannot be clearly linked to any of the identified families most likely descend from lost exemplars that received a comparable treatment. which explains why building a closed stemma for this work is a wild goose chase. Lastly, it is worth noting that CA can be taken as a sort of snapshot, so to speak, of K's estate in the second third of the 9th century. As the latter underwent another correction campaign by K3, who heavily obliterated the revision performed by K2, CA may help us to restore the appearance of his mobile antigraph at a specific moment in time, with the caveat that CA2 underwent at least one correction campaign by a later hand, and that therefore its readings should be carefully assessed on a case-by-case basis. Thank you for your attention.